I've thought about what I would say to her, the woman I was before all of this. I've imagined sitting across from her at the small corner desk she loved, the one with the window that looked out over the gray November street. And I've imagined watching her the way you watch someone who doesn't know what's coming. Someone who still tucks a blue pencil behind her left ear every morning, like it's a talisman, like it's a charm against loss. I've thought about what I would warn her, but I've decided I wouldn't say anything at all, because she needed to find out the way she found out. She needed the file with the mismatched date. She needed the pause that lasted 1 second too long when she asked a simple question. She needed 7 years of silence to end exactly the way it ended, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, in a glass conference room on the 14th floor, with rain against the windows and a woman she had never properly noticed standing in the doorway holding a single folded piece of paper. She needed every one of those things to become who I am now. And I think even now, even knowing everything, she would have trusted him anyway. She was archiving old project files on a Tuesday when she found it. Not dramatically, not with a crash of realization, or a cold sweat, or a trembling hand. That's not how these things happen. What happened was quieter. Miriam Castillo was sitting at her corner desk on the 9th floor of Hale & Sutton Architecture, 4:30 in the afternoon, a cup of tea cooling beside her left elbow. And she pulled a manila folder from the bottom of a lateral drawer that hadn't been properly sorted in at least a decade, and she opened it. And she noticed that 2 dates did not match. That was all. 2 dates. She didn't know yet what they meant. She set the folder to one side, finished her tea, turned off her desk lamp, and drove home through light rain. She made soup from a can. She put the blue pencil on her bedside table the way she always did. She slept adequately. She didn't know yet that she had just found the first thread, or that the thread was attached to something she had spent 7 years trying not to think about, or that the man who had given her this job, this desk, this rebuilt life, the man who had once sat across from her at a lunch table and told her she was the best financial mind he'd ever met and that she deserved a fresh start, was the reason the thread existed at all. She would find out. But not yet. Miriam had come to Hale & Sutton 3 years earlier with a resume that had a careful gap in it. Not a lie, she had never been able to lie well, which was, she sometimes thought, part of what made her good at finding the lies of others. But a careful omission. Between the years of her first career staff accountant at Westfield Municipal Finance, then senior auditor at the same office, and her arrival at Hale & Sutton, there was a period she had learned to describe as a professional transition, which was a phrase that covered, if you held it at the right angle, a complete collapse. The municipal finance scandal had not been her fault. Every investigation, every internal review, every formal inquiry had concluded the same thing. Miriam Castillo had not participated, had not known, had done everything correctly. The man who had participated and known and done everything incorrectly had been her direct supervisor, a man she had recommended for promotion 8 months before the investigation began, a man whose reports she had reviewed and trusted and co-signed. The investigations cleared her. The field did not. Because in a small enough professional world, being adjacent to a catastrophe, even innocently, leaves a mark. She had spent 2 years applying and being politely declined. She had spent 6 months doing bookkeeping for a cleaning supply company out of an office above a parking garage. She had spent a season believing that the version of herself she had built, methodical, trusted, the woman who caught errors others missed, was simply gone. That the person who had rebuilt herself after her sister died had now lost the second life she'd constructed on top of that grief. And then David Hale had called her. She hadn't known him. He had found her through a mutual contact, he'd said. He needed a head of financial compliance for a firm that was growing faster than its administrative structure could handle. He'd heard she was thorough. He'd heard she saw things. She'd told him about the gap in her resume at their first lunch. She still remembered the exact quality of the light in that restaurant afternoon. Gold, coming through slatted blinds and landing on the white tablecloth between their water glasses. She had expected the polite withdrawal that came after the disclosure, the sudden recollection of other candidates. He had folded his hands on the table and said, "Every good accountant I've ever known has been burned by someone they trusted. If you hadn't been, I'd wonder about your judgment." She had started the following Monday. That was 3 years ago. And in those 3 years, she had built something she had almost given up hoping for. Not friendship exactly. Miriam was not someone who accumulated friends the way other people did, easily, without effort. But a working relationship with David Hale that felt, for lack of a better word, safe. He consulted her. He listened when she raised concerns. He was 61 years old and had the particular warmth of someone who had already proven himself and no longer needed to compete. And in his presence, she had slowly, incrementally, stopped checking the conference room door twice before every meeting. Almost stopped. She kept the blue pencil. She always kept the blue pencil. It had been her sister Kara's. Kara had been an architecture student, 22 years old, the kind of person who could not pass a building under construction without stopping to look up at its skeleton and feel something purely happy about the future that was taking shape inside it. The pencil was a cheap drafting pencil, sky blue barrel, HB lead, and Miriam had found it in Kara's coat pocket at the hospital 7 years ago and had not known what to do with it, and so she had put it in her own pocket and kept it. She sharpened it precisely once a year, on the first day of December, which was the month that Kara had died. She tucked it behind her left ear every morning. She had never explained this to anyone at Hale and Sutton, and no one had ever asked. She was active and methodical and externally composed. Miriam Castillo. She always sat where she could see the door. She always filed copies of important documents in 2 separate locations. She always kept a personal record of decisions made in meetings that were not officially minuted. Not because she expected catastrophe, because catastrophe had taught her to expect it. The false belief she carried was quieter than it sounds. It was not, "I am safe now," exactly. It was something closer to, "I have done everything right this time. I have been careful enough. I have built something on solid ground. The thing that broke before was built on someone else's foundation. This time, I built mine myself." She believed this. On the Tuesday she found the folder, she still believed it completely. The folder contained correspondence from 7 years ago, project-adjacent material that had somehow been misfiled into the general financial archive rather than the project archive. This happened occasionally in old firms Hale and Sutton had been in operation for 22 years and had gone through 3 different filing systems. Miriam had been conducting a low-priority digitization project for 8 months, working through the older lateral drawers 1 folder at a time, and she found misfiled items regularly. What she found in this folder was a set of internal cost estimates and a brief memo, dated July of a year 7 years prior. The memo referenced a project called Aldrin Civic, a structure she didn't immediately recognize, and the mismatched dates were there in the header. The memo was dated July 12th, but in its body, it referenced a structural review that was dated, per the attached estimate, August 3rd of the same year, which was impossible if the memo had been written in July. A review that occurred in August could not have been referenced in July. She noted it, set the folder aside, and drove home. The next morning, she came in early, put her tea on, tucked the blue pencil behind her ear, and opened the folder again at her desk with the gray November light coming through the window. She was looking for a simple explanation. A typo in the year, a transcription error, a scanning artifact. These things happened all the time. The most boring answer was almost always correct. And Miriam had spent enough of her career finding the boring answer inside what looked like complexity that she had a reflexive skepticism about drama. She searched the project archive for Aldrin Civic. There was no project file under that name. She searched variations. Aldrin, Civic Center, the year, the client name referenced in the memo, a development company called Vellum and Partners. The Vellum and Partners file existed. It was thin, and it was from the same period, and it contained a signed contract for preliminary design services on a mixed-use residential building. The contract had been terminated. The termination notice was dated 8 months after signing. There was no notation of why, no project file, no structural documentation, no completion record. Miriam drank her tea. She considered the empty space where a project file should be. She was not yet alarmed. She was curious, which for her was a different and more focused state. She annotated the discrepancy in her personal record. She checked the building permit database for the city from that period, searching for structures associated with Vellum and Partners. She found it in 40 minutes. Not Aldrin Civic. The project had gone forward under a different name and a different design firm of record, a small firm called Soto Structural Consulting. And the building that had resulted from it, a residential and commercial tower on Aldrin Street in the Eastern District, had been completed and occupied. And then, 18 months after occupancy, a section of the 4th floor concrete walkway had failed. 11 people had died. Miriam sat very still at her desk for a long time. The building was called Aldrin Tower. She knew that name. Everybody in the city knew that name. It had been 7 years ago, the kind of tragedy that changes the way an entire city thinks about the buildings it walks through. There had been investigations, hearings, citations. The design firm on record, Soto Structural, had been found negligent. The lead engineer had lost his license. The project had become a case study in building code failure. And none of that had anything to do with Hale and Sutton, as far as the public record was concerned. Miriam looked at the memo in her hand. She looked at the date discrepancy. She thought about the absent project file. She thought about a signed contract for preliminary design services that had been formally terminated 8 months in, with no reason noted. She thought about her sister, Kara, who had been visiting a friend who lived on the 3rd floor of Aldrin Tower on a February morning 7 years ago. Kara, who had been standing in the 4th floor common walkway when the concrete gave way. Kara, 22 years old, who had planned to be an architect, whose blue drafting pencil Miriam had found in her coat pocket at the hospital and kept because she hadn't known what else to do with it. Her hands were folded on the desk. She did not move them. She breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had been taught in the 2 weeks of grief counseling she'd attended after Kara died, before she'd stopped going because it felt like she was underwater and couldn't hear anything being said to her. She reached up and touched the pencil behind her ear. She looked at the memo. Then she looked at the window, where rain was starting again, thin and cold against the glass. She had 4 active questions now, and she would not let herself run toward any of them yet. She wrote them down, clearly, in her personal record. 1. Why did Hale and Sutton have preliminary design services documentation for a project associated with Aldrin Tower when the firm's name appeared nowhere in the official record? 2. Why was there no project file? 3. Why did the date on the memo not match the date of the structural review it referenced? 4. Who, specifically, at Hale and Sutton had been the project contact for Vellum and Partners? She did not yet look up the answer to question 4. She closed her personal record. She went to a scheduled client review meeting at 10, and she sat across the table from 2 partners and a general contractor and noted 3 billing discrepancies that saved the firm $40,000 and said nothing about any of this to anyone. She was not ready. She needed to understand what she had first. She drove home that evening in heavy rain. She made rice. She sharpened a different pencil, not the blue one, and she started a second private document, encrypted, saved on a personal drive she kept in her desk drawer, not on the firm's server. She titled it, Aldrin, Preliminary Questions Only, not Conclusions, not yet. She was careful. She had always been careful. She did not know yet that she was already too late to be careful enough. The answer to question 4 came on Thursday morning, when she located the original client intake form for Vellum and Partners in a scanned document subfolder she hadn't reached yet in her digitization project. The firm contact listed was David Hale, principal. The form was initialed at the bottom by him personally. His initials were D.R.H. She knew them from 3 years of co-signed documents, and they were there, in his handwriting, at the bottom of a contract for a project that officially, publicly, had no connection to Hale and Sutton at all. She sat with that for a very long time. She thought about what it might mean. She was someone who had spent a career resisting the jump to the most dramatic interpretation, because the boring answer was almost always right. So she searched for the boring answer. Perhaps the project had been legitimately transferred to Soto Structural early on, and the firm's withdrawal had been clean, and the mismatched date was a clerical error, and the absent project file was simply misfiled somewhere else. Perhaps all of this had an innocent explanation she wasn't seeing yet because she was holding it at the wrong angle. She tried the boring answer on. She wore it for an afternoon. She made herself list the 3 most likely innocent explanations and wrote them down carefully in her private document. They didn't quite fit. They kept not fitting. The way a coat that's almost the right size keeps not fitting. You can make it work for a few minutes, but then you move your arms and the seam pulls wrong, and you know. On Friday afternoon, she asked David Hale a question. She framed it as a routine inquiry related to her digitization project. She told him she'd found some old Vellum and Partners material in the General Archive and wanted to make sure she filed it correctly. Did it belong in the Terminated Projects folder or somewhere else? He was standing at the narrow window of his corner office, the one that looked out over the north side of the city, holding a coffee mug in both hands. He was a tall man, David Hale, with white hair he kept neat and a way of standing that suggested he was more comfortable on his feet than in a chair. He turned when she asked the question. He said, "Vellum and Partners, that's old. Must be what, 7 years?" She said yes, approximately. He said, "Terminated contract. We pulled out early. The client's financing fell through. As I recall, put it in terminated projects." He turned back to the window. She said, "I couldn't find a project file, just the correspondence and the intake form." He said, "There wasn't much to file. It didn't get far." She said, "Of course." She thanked him and left, walking back to her desk. She noted 2 things in her personal record. 1, he had said the client's financing fell through. The contract termination notice contained no such explanation. It said only, terminated by mutual agreement. 2. When she had said there was no project file, he had answered before she'd finished the sentence. She had not told him she was looking for a project file. She had said she couldn't find one. He had supplied the explanation before she'd asked for it. That was not how David Hale operated. In 3 years, she had watched him in difficult conversations with contractors, with clients, with city inspectors, and his characteristic response to unexpected questions was to pause. He was a pauser. He thought before he spoke. It was one of the things that made her trust his judgment. He had not paused. She picked up her tea, which was cold. She drank it anyway. She looked at the rain on the window. She began, that evening, to investigate in earnest. Over the following 2 weeks, she did what she was built to do. She was systematic, and she was quiet, and she did not change her routine by one visible increment. She came in at the same time. She attended the same meetings. She brought David Hale his coffee twice, as she occasionally did, from the cart downstairs, and she sat across from him in a project review on a Wednesday and noted his billing questions with the same neutral attention she always brought to everything. She was doing 2 things at once. On the surface, her job. Underneath, something else. She had, in the beginning, no fixed conclusion. She had a set of anomalies that might or might not connect. And she was a person who had made her career on the discipline of distinguishing what the evidence showed from what she wanted it to show. She did not want it to show anything particular. She was afraid of what she wanted it to show. Because if she was honest with herself, and she was, always, even when it cost her, she was aware that she had been carrying Kara's death for 7 years without resolution, and that the desire for a reason, a responsible party, a comprehensible cause, was a desire that could make a person see patterns that weren't there. She was careful about this. She wrote it down in her private document. I am not looking for someone to blame for Kara. I am looking for an answer to a date discrepancy in a memo. Stay with the evidence. The evidence over those 2 weeks was uncooperative in its direction. She located, through the public permit archive, the sequence of design documents submitted for the Aldrin Tower project. Soto Structural Consulting was listed as designer of record from the earliest permit application, but the permit application itself, a standard document, mostly boilerplate, referenced a preliminary structural study whose numbering system and formatting she recognized. She had spent 3 years learning the administrative language of architecture firms. And the numbering system on the preliminary structural study was Hale & Sutton's, not Soto's, not any other firm's. She found, in a public record of the City Council infrastructure hearings from 5 years ago, a deposition summary from the Aldrin Tower investigation. The summary stated that Soto Structural Consulting had provided a structural analysis review that had been used in the original permit application. The summary stated that this review had been later found to contain material misrepresentations regarding load calculations on the 4th floor support system. The summary stated that the review was dated August 3rd. She had a memo referencing a review dated August 3rd. The memo was dated July 12th. Someone had written a memo in July that referenced a review that, in the official record, existed in August. The boring answer kept failing. She sat at her desk on a Sunday, the office empty around her, the building quiet except for the ventilation hum and, distantly, the sound of rain. The blue pencil was behind her ear. She had brought it on Sundays since Kara died, because Sundays had always been the hardest day, and she had never quite been able to explain to herself why she did it, except that it made the hardness slightly more bearable. She opened the permit archive on her laptop, and she looked at the Aldrin Tower structural study, and she looked at the Hale & Sutton numbering system. And she thought about the woman who had trusted, for 3 years, that she had finally built something on solid ground. She thought, what if the ground was built on something she hadn't been told about? She did not cry. She was not, by nature, a person who cried easily, which had sometimes made her feel broken and sometimes made her feel protected. And she had never been entirely sure which interpretation was correct. She simply sat, very still, with the rain against the window and the hum of the ventilation system around her. And she understood that she was about to do something that would cost her. Whatever way it landed, she thought about Kara, 22 years old, a walkway on a February morning. The sound her phone had made when the hospital called, a sound she had never been able to assign to memory exactly, only to the body the specific physical sensation of her sternum going hollow. She opened a new section in her private document. She wrote, "Working hypothesis. Hale and Sutton performed structural work on what became Aldrin Tower. That work was concealed from the public record, either during or after the project, and was attributed to Soto Structural Consulting instead. The preliminary structural study filed with the permit may have originated here. The date discrepancy in the internal memo may indicate that documentation was altered, either the memo or the review date, to create a record that didn't exist in the form in which it appears." She wrote, "I do not yet know why." She wrote, "I do not yet know how far this goes." She wrote, "I do not yet know if David Hale knew." She underlined that last line, not because she doubted it, but because she did not want to stop doubting it. She had been wrong once before about the honesty of someone she had co-signed documents with. She did not intend to make that error of certainty again. She saved the document, encrypted it, and went home. She made soup from a can. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at Kara's photograph on the refrigerator. Kara at 20. Standing in front of a building under construction somewhere, squinting into the sun, delighted, and she said, very quietly, out loud, to the empty kitchen, "I'm not sure what I found yet, but I'm going to be sure before I do anything with it." Kara had always been the more impulsive of the two of them. If she'd been here, she would have already sent a dozen emails. Miriam, the older sister, methodical and careful, would have been the one saying, "Wait. Understand it first." She pulled Kara's photograph gently off the refrigerator magnet and set it on the kitchen table face up and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it back. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. Now let me tell you what I know, that she didn't, looking back from where I stand. She thought the worst of what she might find was that David Hale had made a professional error, or covered up a professional error, or that the firm had a liability it had been managing in secret. She thought the worst was institutional. She thought the worst was financial and legal and something that would require an attorney and a regulatory body and, perhaps, the end of a career she had built with extraordinary care. She didn't know yet that David Hale had a son. She didn't know his son's name was Marcus, and that Marcus was 23 now and used a wheelchair, and that 7 years ago, Marcus had been 16 and doing a weekend internship at a commercial tenant on the 2nd floor of Aldrin Tower when the 4th floor walkway came down. She didn't know that the reason David Hale had altered a structural document was not only to protect the firm, it was because the thing he was protecting himself from was the knowledge of what his own work had cost his own son. And that knowing it, really knowing it, as a fact he had to stand in front of, had not happened on the day of the collapse. It had happened slowly, over years, in the way that the worst knowledge sometimes comes not as a lightning strike, but as a tide, coming in inch by inch, until one morning you realize the shore you were standing on is gone. She couldn't have known any of that yet, but I'm telling you now because the story doesn't make sense without it. She was doing what she always did, two things at once, when the investigation shifted. She had spent the third week building a parallel timeline. On one side, the public record of Aldrin Tower, the permits, the inspections, the deposition summaries from the inquiry. On the other, everything she could locate from Hale and Sutton's records from the same period, which was not much because the project file was absent, but which included the misfiled memo, the Vellum and Partners intake form, 3 internal cost estimates that had been filed in the General Archive, and a set of meeting minutes from a principal partners meeting in October of that year, 4 months before the collapse, in which the item Vellum Project Closeout appeared on the agenda. The closeout was listed as completed. No further detail. She was also watching David Hale. She had always been good at this, at attending to the background behavior of the people around her while appearing to attend to something else. She had developed this as a child, the older sister to an extrovert, learning early that the quietest person in the room was often the one who saw the most. She watched David Hale across conference tables and through the glass wall of his office, and in the brief moments they stood together at the elevator or the coffee cart, and she was cataloging. He was exactly as he had always been in most ways. He was kind and attentive, and he asked after her cold, which she'd had in the second week, and he remembered her tea preference. He said good morning with the same even warmth, and he held the elevator door, and he was, by any external measure, unchanged. But he was also sleeping badly. She could see it in the skin beneath his eyes. And once, only once, when she passed the half-open door of his office at 6 p.m. and glanced in, she saw him sitting at his desk, not working, not reading, not on his phone, but simply sitting, his hands flat on the desk surface, looking at nothing she could identify, just looking, with an expression she had no name for exactly, except that it reminded her of the expression on faces at Kara's memorial service. The expression of someone sitting inside a consequence they can't undo. She kept walking. She did not alter her pace, but she wrote it down that evening. 4 p.m., office, alone. Expression, something I don't have a category for yet. Not fear, not guilt exactly, something older. And the closeout meeting was October. The collapse was February. They closed out the project 4 months before it collapsed. She wrote, "They knew something was wrong and they walked away." I don't know yet if walking away is the same as causing harm. I need to know more before I decide that. She still had question 4 open. Who else at Hale and Sutton had been involved? The partners' meeting minutes showed 2 other attending principals, both of whom were no longer with the firm. She was beginning to understand the shape of the thing, but she could not see all of it yet. The shift came from a direction she hadn't been looking. On a Thursday morning in her 4th week of private investigation, the firm's receptionist, Priya, set a cup of tea on Miriam's desk. This was not unusual. Priya, who had been at Hale and Sutton for 31 years and had outlasted 3 generations of principals and 3 complete office renovations, brought tea to the people she liked. She was 63 and wore her silver hair in a precise braid and had a talent for being present in a room without anyone noticing she was there. She had worked the front desk through the entire period of the Vellum and Partners project, through the collapse, through the inquiry. Miriam thanked her for the tea, and Priya lingered a moment, which she did not usually do, and said, quietly, "You're going through the old lateral drawers." Miriam said yes. Priya said, "You found something." It was not a question. Miriam looked at her carefully. What makes you say that? Priya said, Because you've been different for 4 weeks. Not visibly, but different. She paused, and then she said something Miriam hadn't expected. Your sister was Miriam Castillo. The air in the room changed quality. Miriam said, Yes. Priya said, I recognized your last name when you started. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place and I didn't know if you knew. Miriam said, very carefully, Knew what? Priya said, That you were working at the firm that designed the building. She looked at Miriam steadily. I thought perhaps Mr. Hale had told you. Later I thought perhaps he hadn't. But I wasn't sure it was my story to tell. The rain had started again outside. Miriam could hear it on the glass above the ventilation hum. She thought, I have been sitting in this building for 3 years. I have been sitting in this building for 3 years and not knowing, she said. Priya, what do you know? Priya was quiet for a moment. She looked at the door, not with fear, Miriam noted, but with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to decide something, and has now decided. She said, I have something I kept. I've had it for 7 years. I kept it because I didn't know who to give it to, and I was afraid. And then time passed, and I was more afraid. And then more time passed, and I thought maybe it was too late and it wouldn't matter anymore. She said, Then you arrived, and I watched you, and I've been waiting to see what you would do. She said, I think it matters. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I need you to understand what this felt like for her. For the woman I was. She had spent 4 weeks being methodical and careful and refusing to let herself feel the shape of what she was uncovering, because feeling it would compromise her ability to see it clearly. And she had always chosen clarity over feeling, because clarity was something she could control. She had lost Kara, and she had lost her first career. And she had rebuilt herself twice, and both times she had done it by being careful, by being precise, by not letting the feeling get in front of the fact. Priya set a folded piece of paper on her desk, just one sheet, plain white, printed, slightly worn along the crease lines from however many years it had spent folded in whatever place she'd kept it. And Miriam looked at it and understood that the thing she had been most careful not to feel for 4 weeks, for 7 years, was about to become unavoidable. She was still careful. She picked up the paper. She unfolded it slowly. She read it. It was a structural calculation review. Internal document, Hale and Sutton letterhead, dated August 3rd of 7 years ago. Standard format for the firm's internal engineering reviews. Except that on the bottom of the page, in handwriting she had learned to recognize over 3 years of co-signed documents, David Hale had written, Discard previous version. Use this one. And the load calculations on this version were different from the ones in the public permit record. The ones in this version were lower, significantly lower, in ways that, to Miriam's non-engineering but financially trained eye, trained by 3 years in an architecture firm to read technical documents for budget and compliance purposes, would have changed the safety rating of a 4th-floor support system. She set the paper down on her desk. She looked at Priya. She said, Where did you get this? Priya said, I was scanning documents for the Vellum project closeout. I found 2 versions of this in the print queue that hadn't been collected. I kept both. The other one, the original version, with the higher numbers, I kept that too. I have both of them, Miriam said. Why didn't you give them to the investigation? Priya said. Because by the time the investigation happened, the firm's name wasn't anywhere near it. I didn't understand what I had. I didn't understand that what I had mattered to the investigation. By the time I understood, the investigation was over, and I was afraid of what it would mean for me to have kept them for that long without coming forward. She paused. I thought about your sister, more than you know. I'm sorry, Miriam said. I know. She said it because she did know. She didn't mean it as an absolution. She meant it as a fact. She believed, looking at Priya's face, that this was true. She picked up her encrypted drive from the desk drawer. She said, "Can you get me both copies today?" Priya said yes. She put the drive in her pocket and she sat for a moment longer at her desk, with the rain against the window and the blue pencil behind her ear, and the single sheet of paper in front of her. And she thought, carefully, about what to do next. She had the evidence. She had the witness. She had, now, a sequence she could trace from the original structural work through the document alteration, through the formal transfer to pseudo-structural, through the collapse, through the investigation in which Hale and Sutton's name did not appear. She had enough to go to a regulatory body, or an attorney, or, if she chose, directly to the journalists who covered the Aldrin Tower inquiry, and had never quite been satisfied with its resolution. She also had, still, the question she had underlined in her private document weeks ago. She did not yet know how far this went. Specifically, she did not yet know whether David Hale had altered the document, knowing it would be used, knowing it would form the basis of a permit for a building people would occupy, or whether the alteration had been made and then the document had traveled a path he hadn't expected. She told herself this distinction might not matter legally. She told herself it mattered to her anyway. She thought about the expression she'd seen on his face at 6 p.m, through the half-open door of his office. The expression she'd had no name for. She needed to understand it before she did anything with what she had. She didn't know yet that he was going to come to her first. It was a Friday afternoon, nearly 5 o'clock, the office beginning to empty around her. She was copying both versions of the structural review onto her encrypted drive, working quietly at her desk with the folder Priya had brought her spread to one side, when she heard footsteps and looked up. David Hale was standing in her doorway. He looked at the folder on her desk, then at her, then at the door, briefly, the way she looked at doors, and then back at her. He said, "I owe you a conversation," she said very calmly. "Yes, I think you do." She left the drive in the laptop port. She closed the folder and set her hands flat on top of it. She waited. He came in and sat down across from her desk, not in the visitor chair, but in the second desk chair she kept against the wall, pulling it around so they were at a slight angle, not directly facing each other. She had seen him do this in difficult client meetings. It was how he sat when he was not trying to project authority. He said, "How much have you found?" She said, "Enough." He was quiet. He looked at his hands, large hands, the hands of someone who had started as a drafter before becoming a principal, hands that still knew how to hold a pencil. He was, she thought, genuinely exhausted. Not afraid, not calculating an exit, exhausted. He said, "I'm going to tell you something I have not told another living person, and I need you to hear it before you decide what to do. Not because it changes anything legally, it doesn't, but because I need you to know." He said, "My son Marcus was in that building." She looked at him. He said, "He was 16. I had arranged an internship for him with a commercial tenant on the second floor. I was proud of the project. I was proud of what we'd done on the structural review." His voice was entirely flat. Not controlled flat, the way a surface is flat after something has gone over it many times. He was there on a Saturday morning doing some filing work for the tenant. He was on the 4th floor common walkway when it came down. He survived. The wheelchair is permanent. He looked at his hands again. He doesn't know the firm was involved. I have spent 7 years not being able to tell him, because telling him means telling him that I put him there, that I put him in a building where I had altered a document I shouldn't have altered, for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time and are indefensible in any light I've tried to hold them up to since. Miriam sat very still. The rain was against the window. The ventilation hum was steady around them. She said, "Why did you alter it?" He said, "Because the original calculations came in over budget, by a margin the client threatened to terminate over. And I made a judgment. I told myself it was a judgment that the numbers could be revised without meaningful impact on the structure. I was not an engineer. I was not qualified to make that judgment. I knew that. I made it anyway." He paused. After the closeout, after we transferred the project, I tried to tell myself the building would be fine, that my numbers were close enough, that I was worried about nothing. He looked at her. "Your sister was also there." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know. I knew when I hired you. I had already spent 2 years knowing your name. I'd read every account I could find of everyone who died. And then a mutual contact told me your name, and I thought..." He stopped, started again. "I told myself I was offering you a job because you were good," which was true. But I also told myself that I could do something for you, that I could give you back something, which was... He closed his eyes briefly. "I understand if that makes it worse." She looked at the folder under her hands. She thought about Kara. She thought about the photograph on her refrigerator, the squinting and delighted face in the sunlight. She thought about the blue pencil behind her ear and all the mornings she had tucked it there in this building. In the building of the man who knew. She said, "It does make it worse." She said, "And I believe you that you're sorry." She said, "That doesn't help me decide what to do." He said, "No, I know. I'm not asking you for anything. I wanted you to know. I've been watching you for 4 weeks and I couldn't. I needed you to know before you decided. Whatever you decide." He stood up. He looked at her desk, at the folder, at the blue pencil behind her ear that she didn't realize he'd noticed until he said, quietly, "Your sister carried a pencil like that." She felt something in her chest that she did not try to name. She put her hand up to the pencil and held it there. He said, "I'm sorry, Miriam. That is not enough. I know that. But I want to say it to you directly, because I have said it in every other way I could think of for 3 years, without being able to say it in the only way that would mean anything." He left. His footsteps went down the hallway, and she heard the elevator doors. And then there was only the rain. She sat for 2 hours, maybe longer. The office went dark around her as people filtered out for the weekend, and she turned on her desk lamp and sat in the pool of it with the folder in front of her and the encrypted drive full of evidence and the 2 copies of the structural review and 7 years of a grief she had carried, neatly, because carrying it neatly was the only way she had been able to carry it. She thought about what the evidence meant. She thought about 11 dead, including Kara, and Marcus Hale in a wheelchair, and an investigation that had ended with Soto Structural Consulting carrying the whole weight of it, while the firm where the document alteration had originated went on winning awards and taking commissions. She thought about Soto's lead engineer, whose license had been revoked, who had built a family and a career on work that was genuinely careful and had been handed one piece of it that was not, and had not known whose hand had made it careless. She thought about Priya, who had kept 2 sheets of paper in a safe place for 7 years, waiting for someone she could give them to. She thought about David Hale, who had placed his son in a building he had made unsafe and had been living inside that knowledge for 7 years. She thought about the false belief she had been carrying. I have built something on solid ground this time. I have been careful enough. The thing that broke before was built on someone else's foundation. This time it was also built on someone else's foundation, just a different one. And she understood, sitting in the lamplight, that the belief was not something she could have prevented. She had been careful. She had done everything right. And she had still found herself inside something she hadn't built and hadn't chosen. The ground had been prepared before she arrived. The only choice she had ever had, the only one anyone ever had, was what to do once she found out what was underneath it. She picked up the blue pencil. She turned it in her fingers. Sky blue barrel. H.B. Lead. The ghost of Kara's fingerprints long worn away by 7 years of Miriam's hands. She thought Kara would have already sent 12 emails and called a reporter. She thought. Kara would have been right. She thought. And the reason I am not going to just send 12 emails and call a reporter, the reason I am going to do this carefully, the right way, through the right channels, in a way that cannot be undone or disputed or quietly managed, is not because I am afraid. It is because I want it to count. I want it to actually count. I want Soto's engineer to get his license back. I want the Aldrin families to have the complete record. I want the investigation that didn't happen to happen. She opened her laptop. She searched for the attorney who had represented the Aldrin Tower families in the original proceedings. She drafted an email. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote everything, factual, precise, with specific reference to the evidence she held and the witness she had. She sent it at 7:43 in the evening. Then she called David Hale. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting. She said, I've contacted the Aldrin family's attorney. I've told them what I found and that I have a witness and documentation. Whatever happens from here is out of my hands and yours. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, All right. She said, I'm going to resign on Monday. Not because I'm afraid of retaliation, because I can't continue to work here in good conscience while this is being reviewed. I'll be clear about why in my resignation letter. He said, I understand. She said, I need to ask you one question, and I need an honest answer. He said, Ask. She said, Soto's lead engineer. Did he know the numbers were altered when he used them in the permit application? He said, No. He received the document from the client, who received it from us. He had no way of knowing there was a prior version. He reviewed it in good faith. She said, I'm going to make sure that's part of the record. He said, Yes, it should be. She said, That's all I needed. She paused. Then, I'm sorry about Marcus. She said it because she meant it. She meant it as a fact, not as a forgiveness. He said, Thank you, Miriam. She hung up. She sat for another minute in the lamplight. Then she took the blue pencil from behind her ear and set it on the desk in front of her and looked at it for a long time. She thought Kara, I don't know if this is what you would have wanted. I think you would have wanted it done faster. I think you would have wanted it louder. I think you would have wanted me to feel something bigger than this, something that looked more like justice and less like a carefully worded email. She thought, but this is what I know how to do. This is the way I can make it count. She picked up the pencil. She held it in both hands, the way she held it when she was thinking rather than writing. And she thought that this was the thing about objects. They don't change. The pencil was the same pencil it had been on the day she took it from Kara's coat pocket at the hospital. And it would be the same pencil tomorrow, and the day after. And Kara would still be 22 in the photograph on the refrigerator, squinting into the sun, delighted, standing in front of a building that was not yet finished. But she had changed. She had changed in the last 4 weeks, and she had changed in the 3 years before that, and she had changed in the years before that. And the woman who had sat in the lamplight with her hands on a closed folder and understood that the ground was built on something she hadn't been told about was not the same woman who had arrived at this building believing that this time she had finally built something that couldn't be taken from her. Because here was what she knew now. Nothing you build is safe from what you don't know yet. The careful life, the double-checked door, the 2 copies in separate locations, the habit of noting what people avoid saying, none of it is enough to keep the unknown out. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way. And spending your life trying to make it work that way, trying to achieve a safety that doesn't exist, means spending your life braced against something that is never, in the end, going to hold still long enough to brace against. What you can do, the only thing you can do, is decide what to do with it when it arrives. Not before. Not in some prepared, anticipated version of the moment. In the actual moment, with whatever you actually have in your hands. She had, in her hands, a blue pencil, an encrypted drive, a witness who had waited 31 years for someone to see her, and a carefully worded email to an attorney who was going to find, on Monday morning, that the Aldrin Tower case was not, in fact, closed. She thought, it's not enough. It will never be enough. That is true. She thought, it is what there is. She put the pencil back behind her ear. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked out through the empty office, past the closed doors and the darkened conference rooms and the awards on the walls, and she pressed the elevator button. And she stood in the quiet hallway and listened to the rain against the building's glass skin. And she thought about how many buildings she had walked through in her life without ever thinking about what held them up. She did not think that anymore. In the months that followed, the Aldrin Tower investigation was reopened. The documentation Miriam had provided, both versions of the structural review, the internal memo with the mismatched date, the intake form with David Hale's initials. The closeout meeting minutes was sufficient to establish Hale and Sutton's involvement in the original structural work and the subsequent alteration of the record. Priya testified she was precise and calm, and she had been telling herself this story in her head for 7 years, and it came out clearly. The licensing board for the city's design professionals reviewed the case. Soto's lead engineer's license was reinstated. David Hale resigned from the firm before he was asked to. He did not contest the regulatory findings. He gave a statement, through his attorney, that was brief and did not attempt to mitigate. He said that he had made a decision that cost lives, and that he had carried the knowledge of it for 7 years without doing what he should have done in the beginning, which was disclose it immediately. He said that he understood that this accounting was overdue and insufficient. He said he was sorry. His son Marcus read the statement in the newspaper. Miriam did not know what happened between them after that. It was not her story. She found a position at a regulatory compliance firm in the spring. The work was less interesting than Hale and Sutton, and the office had no window that looked out over a gray November street. But it was hers. She had built it, this time, on what she actually knew. She keeps the blue pencil. She sharpens it on the 1st of December. She tucks it behind her left ear every morning. Some mornings she thinks about Kara, squinting into the sun in front of an unfinished building. Some mornings she thinks about Priya, sitting behind a front desk for 31 years, holding a piece of paper, waiting for someone she could give it to. Some mornings she doesn't think about any of it. She makes her tea. She sits down. She opens the first file of the day. The pencil is just a pencil, except it isn't. It never was. It's the thing that reminds her that careful is not the same as safe, and that safe was never the real point, and that the part of herself she lost in each collapse, the first career, the second career, the rebuilt thing she'd believed was finally solid, was not the self she thought she'd lost. The self she thought she'd lost was the certain one, the braced one, the one who believed she could build something the unknown couldn't reach. What she has now is smaller and more durable. She checks the door once, just once, on the morning she cleaned out her desk at Hale and Sutton. She took the blue pencil from behind her ear and stood for a moment at the window, the corner window, looking out over the gray city in the November rain. And she thought about what she would say to the woman who had sat at this desk 3 years earlier, believing she was finally safe. She thought about it for a long time. She decided she wouldn't say anything, because she couldn't have heard it then. She had to find it the way she found it. The rain was still coming down. She put the pencil behind her ear and picked up her bag and walked out. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.